Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Price of Fly podcast. I am joined by Aspiring Misanthrope and Wandering Panda tonight. I was let a notification about 3 hours ago. John Slaughter will not be joining us tonight. And this is our third discussion on what is to be a warrior or warriors and such. And we had agreed, John Slaughter, Wandering Panda, and I, that it would be useful to discuss the idea, given the definition that we agreed upon last time. Can a warrior come back? Can the warrior society or class come back? And so we'll start with you, Wandering Panda. Do you think it can come back?
So I'm convinced not only can it come back, and this is sort of where John and I split, in that it does still exist. Having said that, I'm absolutely in agreement with John that functionally it doesn't currently exist. And so you tell me, Todd, sort of my thought was when it came to that Venn diagram we were all working through on the last stream, I didn't know if Misanthrope had any frustrations with it, anything he would change, and if that would be worth digging into before we got into how are we going to bring it back, so on.
Well, I guess that would be useful to see if we're on the same page. If you saw that video, what would you agree with the definition that we seem to agree on, aspiring misanthrope?
I would have to say that ultimately the argument does weigh between, and forgive me, I'm trying to pull the details back into memory. Ultimately it's a matter of quality versus quantity. It's a matter of soldiers being at the employ of the state apparatus and the warrior being a voluntary lifestyle. That is the definition that I'm going to have to run with for the moment. Sorry, blanking on the details.
All right, back to you, Wandering Panda.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me, and that there is an independence there. I get a little bit sketchy when we talk about them acting independent of the nation, which is just to say, in theory, the warrior should be the fulfillment of the nation, so to speak. And so if they have decided to step back, or if they've decided to do something differently, that's because the nation outside of the warrior class isn't fulfilling its duty.
Okay. Yep. So the warrior caste is the apotheosis of the common soldier. They are the ones who embody not only martial prowess, and thank you for the Venn diagram. Yeah, it's not just a matter of, oh, they're the biggest baddest guy on the block and that's what they do all day. They are martial prowess becomes their virtue, and it becomes the way that they embody the virtues of the society they live in.
A portion of it for sure. And that's, I mean, I don't know, Todd, I don't want to derail where you're going, but I mean, how quickly do you want us to jump in and start sort of postulizing and theorizing?
Well, let's get to the point where, because to see that we're on the same page first, I think is important. But do we all agree that, and I know you have some provisional disagreements with John Slaughter, Wandering Panda, but that right now, in the sort of fully orbed sense, there isn't really a warrior tradition. There might be warriors out of place, but that isn't quite the same thing. Do we agree on that?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. So the question then becomes, can it come back? And I wouldn't go so far as to say it never could, but I do see some serious challenges. The first challenge is there's a sense, and we expounded on this a lot in the last episode. There's a sense in which the warrior has to relate to religion in a way that really people just don't do anymore. It's like there's, the people want to have faith, but they don't have it, or they have faith in an insufficient degree. And it's not like the kind of religious context that, say, a medieval knight or samurai would have had, or even a Greek hero of Homer. And absent that, it's difficult to envision anything like that coming back. Because we all sort of agreed on the importance of how religion was kind of non-negotiable. And if that's the case, unless something like that were to happen, it's very difficult to envision, not necessarily elite forces or commandos or whatever, but a warrior caste coming back. I think that's a big challenge, and the question is, what's the likelihood of the kind of religious revival of any kind of religion that would have to take place for this to be plausible? And at the moment, I don't really see that as happening. I think, well, except for Islam, maybe. Islam seems to be growing pretty rapidly, but Christianity and the other religions seem to be declining. Wandering Panda.
Yeah, so all of that makes sense. Where I would go into that, though, and I'm in agreement with you, is I suspect, I'm prognosticating, whatever, that there will be, John's talked about it, and I can't remember if it was, it wasn't Pinker. I can't remember the thinker who was talking about the idea of catabolic collapse. And so,
That was John Michael Greer.
Thank you. Okay, so that's sort of my expectation. You and I have talked about that a little bit too, in the idea of what happens post fossil fuels. Where are we headed? I'm not convinced that AI is a particular saving grace to this current society we live in and our dependence on fossil fuels. So because of all that therein lies, in my mind, the only means to which a warrior class can come about, because it does, especially as you said, going back to Homer, going into Christian ideas, going into samurai and so on. You need to have some sort of national religion, national spiritual, both ascendancy and transcendency that this caste can participate in. And without that, you're not going to have a warrior class. So right now it's a theoretical, yes, it can, but there's going to be a lot of bumps on the way to get in there.
Okay.
Precisely.
I'm just going to call you AM now for short because it's a long tag. So AM, what are your thoughts?
I agree precisely. There's nothing that can stop it from happening, but it simply won't. We simply won't see a resurgence of something like a warrior caste. Like, basically, if we think about literally the movie The Road Warrior, what happens? A catabolic collapse, a total revamp of society. Now, I don't think we have to get to that extreme of an output to see something like, the knight errant. Like, what is Mel Gibson in The Road Warrior? He is a knight errant who is on a quest to save the world, save himself through saving the world. Right? He is ultimately he is ultimately competent and capable in anything he does, but he has a problem not of accomplishing the task that he sets out to do, but of deciding what it is he wants to do, whether to go back and save the village or just to save himself. That type of dystopian anti-hero, of course, is fiction, and we want our warrior cast to embody something much more. That archetype is embodying something much more like a collapse of the structure around him. So in the traditional sense, where will we see a resurgence of the warrior being a functional and integrated member of society? I don't think that comes about without an existential threat to society that absolutely necessitates this type of person being called up and brought up and trained for the service that his society is asking him to do. As the world empire, just speaking in America, we have a massive institution devoted to that. It's called the military. And it's however many percentage, 0.5% of Americans actually serve in the military. It's infinitesimal. They're not in any meaningful way integrated. Yes, there's vet tickets. Yes, there's discounts. Yes, there's all of this honor and prestige associated with it, but nobody understands what the role of the military is. Well, they know what they're supposed to do, right? The thank you for your service, the deference paid to those who fight for our freedoms and the cliches, and not to rehash old ground on the other live streams, but is the U.S. military a warrior caste? I mean, it's really difficult to say. There's niche pockets that it unquestionably is, but a warrior caste within a larger society, I think, is going to be necessitated by an existential threat that calls upon people to be. And it's not like it's just, oh, well, we're just going to go make super soldiers. No, it will necessitate a large call up of the average human, of the average Joe, the average citizen, to step up and out of their daily lives in order to defend what they truly believe in. Now, an existential threat to a society where people don't believe in it, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, so one thing that needs to be stated here, because I think we're blurring some lines here, in a sort of like post-collapse society, it's like Mad Max, will there be armed men defending communities? Yes. Will they be warriors? Not necessarily. That's the point, because in most cases, these will probably be irregulars or militia, like we saw on the American frontier. Because a lot of times when we think about post-collapse, we naturally think of something like the American frontier. I think because that's the closest thing we have in our collective memory and consciousness is something like what a collapse might look like, though this was the beginning of a civilization rather than its end. Very few of those men were actually warriors. They were just militiamen called up for duty on short notice. So we could argue, yeah, that's quite likely. But that isn't necessarily the same thing as a warrior, as was at least provisionally agreed upon in our last episode. And so I think while we can speculate that that's probably quite likely, that's not necessarily the same thing as a warrior. And I want to make sure that that distinction is made, because I fear we might be blurring that. Wandering Panda.
It's the American Rohirrim. That's where we're headed. And so it's not just like you said, and it's a good distinction to remember. We're not talking simply about say a few families that banded together that were able to keep their holdings in the clear post-collapse, but we are talking about a few dozen, a few hundred families, and we're talking about civilization post-collapse, at which point there are the numbers there that both necessitate in a literal sense, but I would argue as well from a civilizational standpoint require the warrior. Because if we're going back, and I apologize, I just worked through the Iliad this past week as well, and so when we look at that, the warrior caste is required as the highest good, standing there alongside of the priest class, and that in both cases there's sort of two sides to the same coin that are pointing towards what is the greatest existential good for a particular civilization. And so I think the distinction is right and necessary, but I'm also convinced that we're absolutely going to be generating warrior class relatively soon after any sort of primary collapse. But that's also because I believe a primary collapse is going to be very slow, and because of that, at the same time that civilization is sliding down, warrior caste, Neo-Byzantium can be rising up.
Okay, I am. Go ahead.
I would agree that collapse will be slow, but I would only differentiate it. It'll be slow in the core. It'll be slower in developed Western societies than it will be on the fringes of the global society. And as far as like, of course, the national call up of men under arms is not necessarily going to automatically generate a warrior class, right? Not everyone on the frontier could have been described as such, but at some point it is ultimately a numbers game. Who of this generation, of this cohort, steps up to be the leader? Who is the one man out of 100 who will voluntarily, either voluntarily because this is what they've always longed for, or voluntarily because that is the decision at hand, that either they must take upon themselves this way of life to keep their families safe at home and their brothers safe by their side, or do they not? And that's all I have on that topic.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to actually move a possible challenge or even objection into an unexpected way, but maybe not totally unexpected to Wandering Panda, because this riffs off another video I did. So when we talk about the collapse of industrial civilization, we often think of it in terms of other empires collapsing. One, because that's sort of all we have to work with. Two, because there's certain patterns that rhyme throughout history. So Joseph Tainter will, for example, look at the Roman Empire, or also, for example, John Michael Greer or the Chinese Empire, and yeah, there's these repeating, we could say, cyclical patterns, but technological civilization, of course, only in the short term, admittedly, of world history, fundamentally challenges a lot of people's assumptions about those patterns, and we start developing in all sorts of ways that were radically unexpected. And we can see this by at each iteration of technology, the prophets of the future usually get many things badly wrong because they just couldn't envision how things would develop over time. And now, if we have this sort of like inverted Luciferian society, as we talk about with the technological society, where all the moral hazards and externalities of immoral behavior are removed, it leaves this kind of like impression amongst people that don't know anything beyond the horizon of their experience, that this is normal, this is just anything you can do. Why were people so stuffy and buzzkills in the 19th century and earlier? And the idea is there's a fundamental altering in perception and consciousness of people that was common sense to everyone before, because the technology has created this bubble for them to grow up in, and its effect has been catastrophic and huge. So, but I would also argue its absence will lead to a huge effect, but also one that we will have a hard time understanding. Just if you were like in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1800, you'd have a very hard time predicting how things would develop. You would also have, I think, a very hard time with the end of this civilization predicting how things would develop other than broad brushstrokes. So where am I going with this? Well, in the same sense that somebody in the Middle Ages would have thought a flying machine is fantasy, but we just needed to wait for enough time to happen for scientific knowledge and experimentation to lead to airplanes. I believe that there's certain evidences, if we look at like our understanding of the Christian religion or other world religions, perennialism, modern mental science, and so on, that I used to think that anything like, the sort of supernatural mental stuff that you'll read about with like Hindu yogis or saints or other things, or even like, the second foundation from Isaac Asimov, the more mentalist psychic foundation, would just be impossible. But I'm starting to think that maybe that's not the case. Maybe what's happening is that, so for example, we know that minds can affect can create physical effects, right? We have a thought, then we act on that thought, our mind created a physical effect. The next question then is, if that's the case, is it not possible that your mind might be able to cause a physical effect outside of your body? Now, that sounds really woo-woo and esoteric, but if you think about it, it doesn't sound like it should be impossible, given that it's at least possible to have a mental state influence your physical body to do something. And so what I'm tentatively arguing here is that what the machine has done is it's created the superabundance of material necessity so that we don't have to fight and struggle for existence. And not that everybody does, but if you choose to, you can devote your entire life to the mind. And this will create a kind of selection pressure for a breakthrough event where we'll have control of minds and mental objects and the spirit world on par with the scientific control of material objects. And if that happens, then I think we have an entirely different situation ahead of us. Wandering Panda.
So who is in it? I'm trying to make sure I understand what you're saying exactly. Oh man, I'm trying to go back decades. Who was the one in X2 that could move objects with their mind? Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, So my initial thought is, and at this point I'm beating a dead horse, but we've brought it up multiple times tonight. If you look into Homer, if you look into ancient epics, and I'm not super familiar with Gilgamesh, you don't. Let's say Job as well, right? Job and Homer, you don't see what you're talking about. At least on first glance that I can recall. So it makes sense logically, but I don't think there's any precedent for it that I'm aware of, unless, as you had talked about a little bit, whether it was yogis or whether within the Orthodox Church, there's a fair bit of, and this is getting into that dangerous point of, was it God or was it man? But if you look at the saints, particularly in the Orthodox Church, I believe in the Catholic Church as well, but I'm trying to remember any pre-schism ones that, well, I mean, it would be more of the same. Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm unaware of the precedent for the most part, and I have a hard time imagining it in the future.
I can explain a little bit more, but I'll let AM respond first.
So if I could just clarify a few things. You're talking about the disruption between the thoughts that a person has in regards to what is in their best interests, both in their physical and their spiritual and their mental best interests, versus what society dictates those should be, and then that disruption of how a person should naturally go about pursuing virtue and taking care of their own. Our society of superabundance has disrupted that flow. Is that generally what I'm?
Well, that's part of it. So let me rephrase it. The key part of the definition at the middle of the three circles, with the definition of a warrior that Wandering Panda and John Slaughter were interested in addition to like discipline and focus and commitment, was the willingness to use force, violence. And that's what made it a warrior, say, instead of a monk or something, or instead of a prayer warrior. But what I'm tentatively arguing here is that in the same way that the scientific revolution gave us control and mastery of the physical world, which allowed us to do things that would have been heretofore unthinkable, like flying or going underwater in a submarine, that we're on the verge of a mental science revolution that would lead to something like the second foundation and Isaac Asimov's foundation. And if we get to that point, then the use of force just becomes null and moot, because you can just exert your mental power over someone and override their body's determination to do something. Now, if that happens, then I don't think we'll have warriors coming back in the definition that we just used, because they'd be superfluous.
Now, that is a very interesting hypothesis. I think there's also a Star Trek episode about that, where James T. Kirk comes over to the planet, and then they have wars fought by supercomputers, and then they just calculate the casualty rates, and that number of people like go into the incinerator. And then Kirk is the good guy, so he blows up the computers, and he said, "But our perfect society is gone." It's like, yeah, but you're men now. You make your own decisions. So I don't know. That is, especially with the not just the advances in like Neuralink stuff, but also, I don't know, there's always been self-help grifters around. But honestly, the only thing that differentiates people who do and people who do not is the will to act. I'm coming to realize this both in my own life and like just looking at the world around me. The will to act is what it's in most short supply, and that's what's most corroded in a society of superabundance that we live in right now in, the developed Western world. And you don't even need to go back. Well, you don't even need to live in this society of superabundance to appreciate that fact. One of my favorite books on warfare is a fictionalized account of Thermopylae, The Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. What is the first two chapters? It's the destruction of the main character's city, because the militia called out to fight. Oh yeah, they've got armor, but it's not well fitting. It's not well kept. They're doing their first drills very enthusiastically because it's a showpiece. It's there to impress their ladies. But by the time, the sun is getting hot, they have to go home back to their shop, and nobody's really in it. And the very next day, what are they done? Everything is overrun. Everyone is, killed or enslaved, and the entire frame of oh wow, I forget the character's name, but it's not really important. The point is, society that takes care of you to the point where you forget the primal factors of life is a society that dulls your edge, physically, mentally, whatever. it does not connect you. A society that does not connect you with the primal factors of life is one that is a society that does not prepare itself, that does not prepare to defend itself.
Oh, okay. Wandering Panda, what are your thoughts? Now that I explain a little bit more clearly.
So bear with me as a grug. Are you basically talking about like the Force?
Well, what I'm saying is, the old saying, "Mind over matter." What I'm saying is that
Yeah.
if
That our senses were dulled post-industrial revolution to the point that we weren't capitalizing on what we were capable of. But
well, what I'm
post,
saying is that the
yeah.
mental powers that we have or had before the industrial revolution, the struggle to survive, to provide food, clothes, and shelter and reproduce was often so great that it was just very difficult to focus yourself on that. So that's why, for example, you'd have to look at yogis or saints, because these are men that don't have to do those things. Society carved out a little niche for them, and they were able to focus. But there never were very many of them. And what they did, which might sound miraculous or supernatural, might just be the result of what I might call if minds. So since we agree minds exist, minds must exist somewhere, some mental space, for lack of a better word. And if that mental space exists, well, might there not be forces like gravity or like the flowing of water? And if you're attuned with that place, could you then use your mind, because it exists there, to then influence and control those forces in an analogous fashion to us controlling material forces with modern technology? And if so, that just is a total game changer. That would negate so many physical things. And so I'm saying that if that's possible, and I think it is possible, I think a lot of literature, I mean, obviously science fiction, Asimov is famous for this, but also what we're learning about with modern psychology, or even the idea of how, the mind creates reality, hyperstition. If we get to a point where we have a mental science which is as developed as our material sciences, it might just be the case that the warrior as defined becomes superfluous by definition. Because if anybody could just, have this back door into his mind through some sort of mental science, it doesn't matter, if he's a Mongol warrior, you're just going to tell him to stand down, and he wouldn't have a choice. So, Wandering Panda.
Sure. That. Actually, I'm going to bow out on this right now. I'm gonna keep mulling over this. If you and AM want to go back and forth for a minute, because I want to sort of process this.
Of course, what I'm hearing is something like a psycher from the Warhammer 40K universe, someone who is so inept, so adept, so in tuned with another plane of existence that they can manifest that they can manifest that that other dimension in our own physical dimension that we experience as humans.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure if we're on the verge of that level of mental breakthrough, but I certainly do believe that there is another dimension that people have been in touch with for basically the entirety of human history. And the most famous examples of that we can see, not to show my cards here too greatly, but are the examples of the Stigmatists in the Catholic Church, the saints who were granted the gift of the wounds of Christ on the cross. And to this day, scientific analyses have rendered no true explanation. The most recent and most famous one of them being Padre Pio, who lived for 40 years with the stigmata. His hands were bleeding through every hour of the day. And it was... and then at the end of his life, there were no wounds to be found on his body. So the typical wounds are found in the palms of the hands, the centers of the feet, and the wound on the side, where Jesus was thrust through the spear on the cross. Now, that, if we're going to run with the hypothesis presented, that could be a level of, how would you say it? That could be a level of wanting to imitate the sufferings of Jesus Christ so much on that level that those wounds are sustained and maintained through the intensive and superhuman level of mental strength and stamina. But I'm not willing to say that that's purely down to mental science, and I'm gonna say that that's more of a supernatural gift.
Sure, but I wouldn't say that this would happen anytime soon. If we look at, like, say, the beginning of the scientific revolution to the first powered flight, that's like, from Newton to powered flight's like 250 years. It takes a long time, but nonetheless, this process is getting started, which eventually culminates in powered flight and a whole lot more.
Of course, yeah. We had powered flight while we still had horse buggies as the main mode of transportation in cities. It was absolutely bonkers, the amount of technological progress from the 20th century to the 21st.
And so if we envision as a hypothesis, which I think, I haven't yet made a full video on why I think all this is plausible, but I'm increasingly thinking it's plausible that that something like a mental science exists where we can manipulate spiritual or mental phenomena with the same degree of precision that we can physical. Now, we might argue it took a long time to get to this level of manipulation of physical phenomena. It's going to take a long time to get to the level of spiritual phenomena. But the point is, though, we've had this sort of like bottleneck selection pressure where, we don't have to worry about the struggle for survival. So people who want to can just become more attuned to this without having to worry about where their food or clothes or shelter is going to come from, which would have been a limiting factor in the past.
So we went from the Battle of Britain to Men Who Stare at Goats. That's the next leap?
Yeah.
All right. That will be in for a ride then, because I believe that's based on some declassified actual experiments or something.
Well, because here's the thing.
I have no doubt that there are some wild things going on that we as Americans will probably never see.
Well, right, because obviously what I'm trying to lead with this is I don't think the collapse of technological society is going to look as much like, say, the collapse of Rome or China as we might think. Because I think several fundamental changes have taken place that make it very difficult for it to look just like that. Technological civilization itself has made a lot of tremendous changes and alterations to nature and humanity that we're not going to behave in the same way we would have, say, after Rome falls. There's going to be a lot of differences. And I think one of those, or we could just say, let's go full Akira, right? Maybe the idea being that it's weird, right? There seems to be this like buildup of the idea of a mental science or psychic science. We have like Asimov, we have Akira, we have all this stuff building up. And then, of course, we also have modern day psychology, which, of course, someone who was more, professional like Asimov was appealing to. And I guess I just find these arguments more convincing than I used to. I think the more I look at them, I'm like, maybe there's something to this. And if there is something to this, that radically alters what we might think. So the guy that's, basically, like you said, a psycher, could take down, a stormtrooper, and you would look like this really weird, voodoo to the outside observer.
So I guess I'm trying to understand, though, where the functional difference is between that and any other warrior class.
Well, the functional difference is they're not using violence. They're using some sort of mental technique.
Okay. But they're not using violence per se, but certainly they're participating in a violence of the mind, and they're still achieving the same outcome, is the idea, yes?
Okay, well, they're not. Well, this is an important distinction we haven't made yet. In your Venn diagram, when you said the use of violence, acceptance of violence, do you mean the use of force? Because not all violence is force, but not all force is violence. And I think we'd all three agree that this kind of mental attack would be a kind of force, but would it be a kind of violence?
Well, I might posit that, of course, like you can apply force without causing harm or enacting what would be generally viewed upon by the reasonable observer as violence. However, if we're just going to stick in this hypothesis for a little bit longer, I'm reminded of a brief one little line from Gandalf at the end of Two Towers saying, "If I had pressed you harder, I would have broken you," when he's asking Pippin about what he saw in the Palantir. So I'm not going to, if we're going to, and if we run further with the hypothesis of we have, basically we have, some sort of psycher class of superhumans who are able to just enact their will on the battlefield without actually, let's just say that they could like make a person freeze in place with only using their mind. Let's just say that strain on the person that force is being applied would probably manifest itself in ways that, while immediately might seem nonviolent, but would develop over time as, an incredible oppressive force.
It could. Right. But so it'd be on a spectrum, just like you could tap someone on the head or shoot their head off. Both are uses of force, but one is a lot more violent than the other. There could be a similar spectrum in this hypothetical scenario.
It could be. Havana syndrome is a thing that has been studied.
I don't know if there could be that distinction too clearly made, though, unless I'm totally either missing the point of what you're saying, or where my mind is automatically jumping. And you guys are familiar with I have no mouth and I must scream. Yeah?
No, I'm not.
You're kidding me. Okay. So we got to look into that. But the idea, as I remember it, I have to go back and actually dig into it, reread it and all that. It's post World War III, and there's only 5 people left in there. And I can't remember if it is a supercomputer or what, but he has the people locked down, and he just, they are physically locked down, but the supercomputer is in control of their minds. It just, for whatever reason, he continues to find more and more ways of torturing them inside their minds. And so then my question to you then is that force or is that violence?
Well,
because that seems to be the logical extreme to prove the paradigm. You have?
Yeah. So obviously that would be a hellish existence. But the way I understood the diagram, and maybe this is not what you meant by it, right, is the intentional, when you said the acceptance of violence, what I read that to mean is the intentional use of lethal force for the purposes of killing someone. In this scenario that I'm envisioning, though killing someone might be a knock-on effect of the psychic strain, the intent wouldn't necessarily be to kill someone. You could disable or disarm without doing that as your intention. Now, again, someone might not choose to do that and just decide to destroy someone's, and kill them through some sort of, mental, some sort of like madness-inducing event. But I don't think that using this kind of a force, if we're going to postulate it, is the willful, intentional use of lethal force.
Yeah, but that's a distinction without a difference.
Is it? I mean,
let me say it can be. It can be.
Well, I mean, if you use corporal punishment on someone, that's a meaningful difference than capital punishment.
But okay, so in either case, so you can make the argument that those are violent acts. And so there's a lot of priors that we have to get to that point. And so acceptance of violence, there was still tiers to the violence that was accepted in any given situation. And you brought this up in the idea of transnational warrior identity, in that they didn't have to go to the utmost necessarily. There could still be symbolic acts of violence that weren't necessarily lethal, weren't even necessarily of a maiming sort, but still accomplished what needed to be done to declare some sort of martial victory.
Okay, AM, go ahead.
So, how could I say this? This is a fine hypothesis, but ultimately, like, the desire of war is not actually to kill people. The desire of war is to accomplish a policy aim. And specifically, Marine Corps warfighting doctrine says war is a contest of two opposing wills. So the objective is to defeat the opposing will. You can defeat someone's will without killing them. That's what happens in UFC. That's what happens in a street fight when they call uncle. That's what happens in all sorts of stuff, like in Top Gun Maverick when they're in the circling dive, and then Maverick pulls out before Rooster. That is a surrendering of the will before they both crash into the ground. That is a small battle, just in that one scene. That's a small battle that's won. That is played out 100,000 times over a large geography in industrial warfare, and then transcending geography in modern informational warfare, in the economy, in diplomacy, in the information sphere, in the cyber sphere, and all this other stuff. So I think that while the mental, we'll just, for the sake of the argument, we'll just call it the psycher hypothesis, the person who is so mentally adept that they can manifest their will onto the physical plane and force others only by the exercise of their mind. That may be that may be an interesting hypothesis, but really what we're seeing as who are the people who are able to defeat the opposing wills in the media landscape today are the people who have the right combination of physical power, economic power, informational power, and not to just circle everything back to Twitter, but this is why Elon Musk buying the most powerful narrative creation website on the entire internet is such a big freaking deal, because it is out of the hands of people who wish to keep society static for their own purposes. I'm not saying that everything Elon Musk does is for the benefit of mankind. He certainly has his own personal interests involved in that and wrapped up in the purchase of Twitter. But at least it's not to keep society in a mode of spiritual stasis and keep dispensing the food pellets and just keep everyone on this even keel happy plane where no one is super far above or below the other. That's not existence. That is a form of spiritual slavery and real physical slavery. If everybody in one certain strata is not able to break out, if the overstratification of society, the overstratification of society is its own worst enemy, and it's in its own feet of clay.
All right. One thing that you mentioned, AM, is the contest of wills is the true heart of war. And so Clausewitz says that war is politics by other means, and he also defines war as the attempting to change the other side's mind. So that this is another interesting question with relating to warrior, specifically with the use of force clause. I'm not saying this has happened, but what if it were to be the case that in the future there would be some more effective way of changing people's minds than engaging in the intentional use of violent force? For example, we could imagine a sort of a universally agreed upon arbitration system that over time, because it's just so successful, everybody defaults to and nobody bothers to use force anymore. Or there's other forms of non-compliance or non-resistance that in the long run turns out to be more effective than the direct use of force. So for example, we could think of the Velvet Revolution, which brought down the Soviet Union, which any direct use of force would have allowed the Soviets justification for their complete slaughter of any rebels, like they did in Germany, East Germany, 1950, Hungary, 56, and Czechoslovakia, 68. And so, if we posit that that's a possibility, and that ends up becoming the preferred way for people to change each other's minds, does that then not entail a possible future in which warriors, defined in that sense, is obsolete? Wandering Panda.
Sure. So as you're going, I'm thinking of Tokyo Rose, and I'm just thinking of general propaganda campaigns. And sure, it's the lines start getting blurred because it's a question of what does a person desire, and can whoever the powers that be, whoever they are, can they affect that will in a seemingly nonviolent way, which then gets into the existential question of, can you violate a person's will if a person wants to operate in such and such manner?
Right. This is just another hypothetical development. I'll ask you the same question, Am.
So I would say that you have successfully described the realm of politics in terms of a more efficient way of settling our disagreements with each other that doesn't involve the use of violence all the time. And I mean, and then not just to, say that the exception proves the rule, but you just described three separate bloody anti-rebellions by the Soviet apparatus, a generation prior to the Velvet Revolution, because one, the push-pull factor was not sufficient, was not in a sufficient ratio that the more people would benefit from having East Germany, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia, going their own way. Maybe not joining NATO, maybe they do their own thing, but it wasn't in enough people's best interest to just say, oh, East Germany, you'll go back with them. It was basically in everybody's best interest. The Soviet Politburo, the people on the street, and the faintingly small middle class of administrators and bureaucrats and soldiers as well, who joined in the revolution, who said, yeah, look, this is a society that's not worth preserving. And well, going back to my original point, where a warrior caste would only exist in we would only see the resurgence of one, rather, in the instance of a existential threat to their society. That actually presupposes that enough people believe in the society to the point where they would actually put the chips down and put their lives on the line. When the propaganda machine kicked in after 9/11, and we saw that reaction. We still had a society that believed in itself, and military recruiting went through the roof. And because we had people who were A, scared, B, believed that we were under attack, and they wanted to do their part, essentially. Now, with regards to bring it back down to the level of everyday life, yeah, we actually engage in many different battles every day, where we are trying to get people to come to our side of seeing things. There's a contest of wills in so many other environments, right? And in terms of defaulting to and really this is just me trying to avoid talking about how Bitcoin solves everything. In terms of people like defaulting to a preferred, more efficient way of settling their differences, I mean, that is basically the money system. The store has a bottle of milk, I have some cash, we exchange, and that's a better system than me just taking the milk for myself, right? That is the universally agreed upon dispute settlement system. When people start monkeying with that for their own benefits, then that push-pull factor ratio gets thrown out of whack. So then when there is a rebellion in the streets, we, are more primed for a type of velvet rebellion. Velvet Revolution. Sorry.
So yeah, the two prongs that I've been pushing here are based on this intuition, is that, and we all can agree that technological civilization has changed things a lot, though ultimately only superficially. The fundamental realities of existence are still the same. But what I'm taking from that is, I think that when it collapses, because of the radical distortion that it created in its appearance, will allow for rather interesting, novel, and heretofore unthinkable realities, which, if you run with this, I think would challenge the future viability of a warrior caste. Because if we just go down the route of, well, if it's just like before, well, then yeah, I'd have to admit, yeah, sure, there will be. Because after Rome fell, you had the Norse warriors, you had the knights. So I'm trying to push us in a slightly different direction to have a little bit more of a creative discussion. Before we wrap up, I'd like to look at some supers, but I do want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. So, Wandering Panda.
So there's sort of two different pillars to this that are in my mind. The one is, can you entice? Can you make a situation enticing enough that it prevents people from operating in a warlike manner? The other potentiality, the other pillar is it worth violating a person's nature? Is it worth implanting ideas? What's that stupid movie? Anyways, where you're planting ideas, so on and so forth, apart
Inception.
from a person's.
You mean
Thank you.
Inception? Yeah.
I do. Is it worth forced inception within people to convince them of an idea that would violate their original nature? And these are some heady questions, and so to put my cards on the table, one, I don't think, when I say we're going to collapse, I'm convinced for various reasons that we are going to collapse, and we are going to become more religious, but that the religiosity isn't going to play out so much in singular abilities. So that would be my initial thought. And then my second thought is, I'm not convinced right now that even sans physical violence, the alteration of a person's will is any less violent conceptually.
Well, that's an interesting question to definitely explore. And I think we can probably do that in the future. So AM, on the two hypotheses that I'm putting forward on the collapse of industrial civilization and how that might alter the future. Before we get to some of the chat, what would you say to that, just in broad brushstrokes?
Well, I think that certainly calling people out of a society of superabundance and then calling them to, how does one go from operating in that one society to another and then becoming this embodiment of basically a new order? Because also one of the problems with modern society is that it doesn't actually have any virtues worth emulating, let alone any martial virtues worth pursuing. Are we actually encouraged on the everyday life to save our money, to be frugal, to think about the long-term future? No, we're only encouraged to do one thing, and that's consume, and really just don't think about anything else. So it's how does one make that jump? I don't think that happens without a spiritual revival. I think that people basically there is a lot more built into the necessity of a resurgence of a warrior caste than just, oh well, now you have to do this or else you don't get food today. Now you have to go out and fight the mobs of people looting the Walgreens because that's the only way to get bread now. No, it's going to require a lot more input, a lot more development, a lot more generation of the things that have been stunted and stultified by modern society, namely the namely the spiritual element of pursuing virtue and delaying gratification for greater goods in the future. Now, I am not basically, I'm not going to throw out the hypothesis that actually Neuralink is being developed initially with, a military application specifically for what, we've talked about here. And I'm, hey, it's a tool. It's a tool, that another tool in the toolbox. That's it. Everything about the application of force and the application of violence is contextual, because it all has to be in pursuit of, again, it has to be in pursuit of changing the other's mind, as Clausewitz says, or defeating winning the competition of wills. That's what ultimately any struggle in a large societal sense is going to involve. On the warrior caste side of things, basically that's what I'll sign off with.
All right.
Society has to regain its virtues that are worth emulating in order to have a warrior caste revive, and that might happen by a loss of this society of superabundance.
All right. One question I think that was fairly relevant to our entire discussion tonight was from JT. What do you think of Bronze Age perverse thesis that as modern society breaks down, we'll see a return of Bronze Age-esque military brotherhoods in peripheral states, e.g. the Caribbean or the Afro-Pacific? And I suppose from Bronze Age perverse perspective, since I read his book, he's probably envisioning even like in the West. Given what I've already said, maybe in the short term, but I'm still a little dubious about the long term, given some of these radical ideas I'm entertaining. But I think this question was also more directed at you, Wandering Panda, and you, AM. So why don't you answer that question first, Wandering Panda?
So I've yet to read the Bronze Age mindset. However, as that question was just described, yeah, that's where I'm pretty much convinced we're going to be headed, is both into superstates and then individual nations with, in an American context, is greater regions, superstates, and then particular families / nations within those areas operating on a more tribal level.
Okay, same question to you, AM.
I don't really think that all these Zuckerberg bunkers and Elon Musk islands are being staffed with all the security in order to stage a Franco-esque recapture of America from the gay race communists. Although that would be so funny if that was actually the plan. No, I think this. I essentially agree. This could basically be a short-term hedge your bets against a broad-scale societal collapse, and then use that as a staging point to reconsolidate power, reconsolidate in whatever the new regime is down the line. Granted, if the Neuralink update is what sends the world into a psychotic rage, a la Deus Ex, then I'm a pass on that, Elon. No brain chips for me, please.
All right. Thanks again, Wandering Panda, AM. Where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter, taking a short break, but still around, at @AN_Misanthrope. I also have a Substack. Please do not subscribe. Whatever you do, don't subscribe to my Substack. It's awful. It's filled with half-filled short stories and musings on the moment of history that we're in. Please just do not subscribe to my Substack.
Okay, Wandering Panda.
His writing's actually pretty good. So on that note, you can find me on X at Wander Mr. Panda. I'm much more of a reply guy. I've got enough going on right now that my thinking's usually on top of a tractor or somewhere else. But anyways, yeah, go ahead and find me on there, and always appreciate it, Todd.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.